This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitahone and today is Monday, and that means it's time for the 490th MTG Top 10. In this series, I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. Before we jump into today's topic, I do want to say that if you're enjoying my content and haven't subscribed yet, consider doing so. More than half of my viewers are unsubscribed, and I'd really appreciate your subscription. Over the years, I've done several MTG Top 10s looking at specific sets, but there's still a whole lot more to look at, and today we're checking another off of the list. We'll be taking a look at Alliances, which came out in June of 1996. Alliances was originally the third and final set in Ice Age block following Ice Age and Homelands. 10 years later, Cold Snap would be released, and Homelands was no longer considered part of the block. Basically, Homelands was such an embarrassment that they retconned it 10 years later. If you're interested in learning more about that strange story, I did write an article about it for Card Kingdom. Anyway, the point here is that these days Alliances is technically the second set in Ice Age block, and part of the reason I'm doing this list is because I've covered all of the other sets I just mentioned: Ice Age, Homelands, and Cold Snap. So taking a look at Alliances helps us complete the block. It's also been over 100 degrees and incredibly humid here in Oklahoma for pretty much the entire month of July, so it seemed like a good time to look at a set that takes place during winter. To be eligible for this list, a card had to receive its original printing in Alliances. In all, there were 144 cards from Alliances that were eligible, and in this video we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours and World Championships, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, and this includes events like Grand Prix and Magic Online challenges. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, it is Thawing Glaciers. This is a land that doesn't actually produce mana, something that was actually kind of commonplace in Magic in the 1990s. However, you can pay one, tap the Glaciers, and return it to your hand to search up a basic land and put it into play tapped. That might not sound that impressive, but it basically means you can always hit your land drops, and over the course of a game, it actually gives you some pretty serious card advantage. Control decks in both block and standard combine the Glaciers with Zuron Orb, as the two together was a pretty effective way to beat any aggro deck, as you could just gain way too much life for them to take you down. It even got banned out of block because it was making it so only control decks could compete. It was played the most in Extended though, appearing in control and combo decks. It hasn't gained points anywhere since 2002, and it isn't very likely that it will ever gain any more points. At number 9, it is Keldoran Outpost. It's part of a cycle of non-basic lands that require you to sacrifice a land of a specific type when they enter the battlefield. That's a downside to be sure, but in addition to tapping for mana of the same color, these lands all come with a pretty powerful activated ability. In the case of the Outpost, you can pay only a single generic and a white to get a 1/1 token. That makes it quite the token factory. It was played in aggro and control decks alike in standard and extended. In aggro decks, it gave you a board sweeper-proof source of creatures, and for control decks, it provided a potential win condition. You could just leave up your mana every turn so you could counter spells and interact, and then if you still had the mana, you could make a token at the end of your opponent's turn, and that would quickly add up. It hasn't gained any points since 1997, and it's unlikely that will change anytime soon. At number 8, it is Arcane Denial. This is a hard counter that only costs 1 generic and a blue, which is definitely above rate. Of course, it comes with a downside. Your opponent gets to draw 2 cards at the beginning of their upkeep. The good news is you draw a card too, so yeah, your opponent ends up with a bit of an advantage, but not a massive one, especially because you probably countered something pretty important. It was particularly attractive for combo decks who could use the card to protect their combos. For those decks, you tended to win the game in a single turn, so it didn't really matter that your opponent would draw those extra cards because you would use the denial to allow you to combo off, and your opponent would never draw those cards. Like the first 2 cards on the list, Arcane Denial hasn't found success in a pretty long time. It was reprinted at Common and Masters 25, and it is seeing a bit of play in Pauper as a result, but so far it doesn't have any points, though it has a significant number of top 16 finishes in the format. It is likely to finally gain some points in Pauper at some point. At number 7, it is Dystopia. This enchantment features the much maligned cumulative upkeep mechanic, but most of the examples of cumulative upkeep that are bad involve mana, and this one doesn't. Instead, you pay life, and every turn you pay 1 more life to keep it around. In this case, 1 life on your first upkeep, 2 on the next upkeep, and so on. Dystopia is a pretty powerful color hoser, as it makes your opponent sacrifice a green or white permanent on every upkeep. This means that your opponent immediately loses something on their turn, so it quickly adds up. You really don't need Dystopia in play for long before it completely wrecks an opposing green or white deck, and you can just stop paying life when it becomes a problem. Obviously enough, Dystopia was a sideboard card, and it was a pretty heavily played one in the standard and extended formats between 1996 and 1999. At number 6, it is Elvish Spirit Guide. The guide is an unimpressive 3-mana 2/2, but it comes with a very powerful ability that doesn't cost any mana. You can exile it from your hand to make 1 green mana. That means this can really accelerate your early game. Unlike the other cards on this list, it didn't see any play in block or standard, and it barely saw any play in extended. But it makes up for that by seeing significant play in other formats, especially in the more recent past. It's been especially successful in both combo and landless decks in Legacy and Vintage. Combo decks are interested in the guide because making your combo go off a turn early is a big deal, and landless decks are, well, landless, so they need to include other sources of mana. Going landless might seem like a really bad idea, but there are several decks in those formats that need to be landless or close to it. One of these is the Goblin Charbelcher deck, which does lethal in a single activation if there are no lands in the deck. You can also find the Spirit Guide in any deck looking to mill their whole library with Balustrade Spy or Undercity Informer. For those 2 cards to do their job, you need no lands in your deck. Basically, both decks can win the game in a single trigger if they have 0 lands in the deck, so a card like the Spirit Guide is very necessary for those decks. It's been quite active in recent years, and it's actually likely to move up this list going forward. At number 5, it is Pillage. For 3 mana, it can destroy an artifact or a land, which is a pretty nice rate. We don't see land destruction like this these days, and it makes me kind of sad, though I'm probably the only one. Anyway, 3 mana is a nice rate for land destruction, so adding the artifact mode is very nice. It helped spawn land destruction decks in standard, and it was also often featured in red aggro decks in both standard and extended. Between 1996 and 1999, land destruction was usually played right alongside burn spells and cheap creatures in those types of decks. More recently, it received a reprint in Modern Horizons, and that gave it legality in the modern format for the first time, a reprint that really upgraded Ponza decks in the format. Those are red-green ramp decks that combine ramp with mana denial, so they can get way ahead of the opponent. It has gained several points in those decks over the last few years, and it's likely to gain more points going forward. At number 4, it is Helm of Obedience. This artifact has a massive box of text, but it basically amounts to this. You can pay X and tap it, then your opponent mills a card one at a time until they either mill X cards or mill a creature card. If you hit a creature card, you sacrifice the Helm and you reanimate the creature on your side of the battlefield. Like Elvish Spirit Guide, Helm of Obedience is not a card that immediately found success. In fact, it didn't gain any points at all in block, standard, or extended. However, it has seen a fair bit of play in both Legacy and Vintage since 2011, where it can provide a pretty nice combo kill. You can combine it with Rest in Peace or Leyline of the Void to mill your opponent's entire library in a single activation. Because of how the Helm works, it checks to see if X cards or a creature card has been put in the graveyard, so keeping those cards from going to the graveyard at all results in game over for your opponent. The deck has also more recently gained Dauthi Voidwalker, which gives you yet another effect that lets you one-shot your opponent. It's going to keep gaining points going forward and has a good shot at continuing to move up this list. At number 3, it is Gorilla Shaman. This little 1-drop packs some surprising power since he can destroy artifacts with a repeatable ability. His nickname is Mox Monkey since he can really effectively deal with 0-mana artifacts like Moxes. He saw some play in both block and extended, but Vintage is where he's done the most work, which makes sense. It's a format loaded up with powerful cheap artifacts. He's also pretty heavily played in Pauper, which is kind of funny because that's a format with no Moxes at all. He's likely to keep gaining points going forward. At number 2, it is Contagion. Probably the most famous cards from Alliances are the cycle of pitch spells, all of which are spells that can be cast for free if you exile a card of the same color from your hand. The 2 best cards in that cycle also require you to pay 1 life, as is the case with Contagion. With Contagion, you have a spell that lets you put 2 -2 -1 counters on 1 or 2 creatures. And yes, I said that right. In the old days, Magic didn't do a great job of standardizing the types of counters, so -2 -1 counters are a thing. This can obviously be used as a pretty effective removal spell, as it can often take down 2 creatures, which means you give up 2 cards and pay 0 mana to deal with 2 of your opponent's creatures, which is a nice deal. It was fairly heavily played in both Standard and Extended, but it's another Alliances card that has done the most work in Vintage. It's been a fixture in Dredge decks in that format since 2007. Those decks aren't quite landless, but they do run very few lands, since they don't actually need much in the way of mana. They just look to get stuff out of the graveyard for free. However, sometimes one needs some removal, and Contagion provides that for Dredge decks without them having to use any mana. It is another card that will keep on gaining points, but it is completely impossible that it ever passes the number 1 card on this list, which is Force of Will. It has almost 10 times the points than the number 2 card on this list has, and yeah, I think this coming in at number 1 is probably the most predictable thing ever, since it is simply one of the best Magic cards ever printed. Like Contagion, it's part of that pitch cycle, and in this case, you get a counterspell. While it only found modest success in Block and Standard, Force of Will was a format-defining card in Extended when it was legal there, and it continues to be one of the key cards in both Legacy and Vintage today. Free counterspells are great, and this is certainly the best free counterspell in the game, and maybe even the best counterspell, period. Sure, you do have to 2-for-1 yourself and pay a life, and doing those things is a cost, but not paying mana is massive. This means that you can tap out to add to the board, and then still be ready to use your Force of Will if the situation arises. Over the years, Force of Will has been pretty close to a staple in both Legacy and Vintage. It continues to gain points at an incredibly rapid pace, and that won't be changing anytime soon. There aren't any cards on this list even remotely close to it, so I don't think it will ever lose its spot as the best card from Alliances. So, those are the 10 cards from Alliances that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more on specific sets, including the rest of Ice Age Block, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can. You can become a YouTube member or a patron and get some sweet perks, or you can buy some Nitsa Hone merch. You can find links to all of those things in the description. Thanks for watching.